Okay, Rose, her mother said, looking at her with a serious expression. We're almost at the end now. Your ability to use honey is far greater than what I would have expected, and based on the trouble you had shutting it off, I believe you most likely could use more of it, should you wish. How much, I am uncertain, but it's clear that your limits on the use of honey are far greater than my own. This, too, is something that you'll have to find out for yourself. But for the time being, it's time to cover the last of your Skyrayan abilities. 2 defensive techniques, which we of the Skyray use to protect ourselves from harm. Being able to summon a helper is quite useless if we're a complete and utter target, whilst he protects us. So we of the Skyray possess 2 defensive techniques that stem from our bloom. The first of which is very simple. It is our petals, Rose. The glow of our petals is not simply something pretty that you can observe. That glow is actually a field of energy produced by the petals. In times of stress, when we are in danger, they are able to intensify that field of energy and become a shield that can protect us from harm. Rose, the 3 rocks that my helper gathered for me, I want you to go pick them up and then throw them at me. This will simply demonstrate the ability. Once again, this works on an instinctual level. There's no great deal of concentration that's necessary for it. No need to commune with nature. Your petals are a part of you, and as such, just like your arms or legs, they will defend you in the same way that you'd use your arms and legs to defend you. They're simply much better at it. So pick up the stones and throw them at me. Okay, Rose said, leaving her placement in front of the large rose that had taken on this bestial form that she was still somewhat wary of, but it seemed to do as she said, so she did her best to ignore it for the time being. Okay, little friend, I want you to stay there. Even if I am attacked, you are to do nothing, Rose's mother said, looking at the small cat-like creature that she created from a flower, as it laid down, in much the same way that the rose that Rose herself had commanded to stay, laid down. She supposed it was simply the way they reacted when given an order to stand still and do nothing. Rose picked up the 3 small stones and turned to her mother. Are you sure about this, Mom? Rose said. Yes, Rose. I'll be fine. It's just a few stones, in order to demonstrate my point. Once you bloom, you'll have to be able to do this yourself, and it's easier to see how it can be done if you actually see it. So go ahead, throw the stones. Okay, Mom, Rose replied, as she pulled her arm back with one of the stones in her grasp, throwing it in her mother's direction, about 20 feet away, much like she would throw a baseball. As the stone hurtled in her mother's direction, one of her petals suddenly moved rapidly, swinging out from behind her and moving in front of her, forming a barrier in between the stone and her mother. There actually seemed to be somewhat of a spark when the stone hit, and a surge of yellow energy that seemed to emit from the source of the impact. The stone fell to the ground. Funny enough, Rose could almost see what seemed to be smoke rising from the stone, as if it had been burned. As you can see, anything impacting the petals, when they're in this heightened state of defense, will receive an unpleasant jolt of the energy produced by the petals. The denser the energy, the more adverse the reaction. So, continue throwing, Rose's mother said, still standing comfortably in her place, seeming to be unworried about getting hit by stones. But Rose did as her mother asked, and grabbed the next stone, throwing it at her. This time, a different petal moved out of place, rapidly moving around her mother's form, this time batting away the stone heading in her direction, once again with another spark of bright yellow energy. And as you see there, her mother said, simply forming a barrier is only the first method of the use of the petals. By launching somewhat of a counterattack, within short range, the petals can deflect incoming projectiles, batting them away, and meeting the same results. Now, Rose, this last one is, well, the most complete defense, offering the greatest amount of protection, but it also has the greatest backfall. This is used when an adversary is too powerful for the petals to simply form a small barricade that might protect us, or bat them away when an enemy is exceptionally dangerous, a predator that is too large and strong for us to frighten away with minor defense. We can choose to sacrifice any mobility in exchange for all-out self-protection. So, if you give me just a moment, once I'm done, throw the stone, her mother said, as her petals began to glow brighter and almost seemed to spread out more, as if they were getting larger. Suddenly, her mother began to kneel down, curling into the fetal position almost, but angling herself so that the flower on her back was sticking straight up into the air, the petals curling and wrapping around her in a circle. It was as if the petals of a flower became completely inverted, like seeing a lily, except the petals worked their way all the way backwards in order to wrap around the bulb that they originated from, leaving only one thing truly visible, a yellow puffball that sat atop the center of her mother's flower bud. The petals had formed a complete shield, wrapping her in every direction. It was like a big glowing soccer ball, or something like that, in which you couldn't reach her mother from any direction. She seemed to have stopped moving for the time being, and the glow around the petals was fairly intense, but had seemed to have stopped growing more intense. There appeared to be no more changes, so Rose assumed that her mother must have been done with this process. Taking a deep breath, she reeled back, throwing the stone at her mother's new defensive form. This time, the petals didn't move or react at all. They simply stayed as they were. The rock impacted with the same jolt of yellow energy as it did before, seeming to smoke a bit as it bounced off, hitting the ground. But as it did, something very new happened. The small puff of yellow that seemed to be based in the very center of her mother's flower bud suddenly burst out. It was like an explosion of yellow glowing pollen that seemed to spread out in a nearly 15-foot radius, nearly reaching all the way out to Rose, as tiny specks of glowing golden light filled the air, so much so that it was as if there was a glowing yellow fog surrounding her mother that simply drifted there. Eventually, the wind began to pick up and the fog shifted away, some of it beginning to fall closer to the ground and scattering there, the rest starting to be carried away by the breeze. And in that moment, Rose saw her mother begin to unfurl from the state that she was in, standing back up, her petals returning to normal. And there we have it, the last of the defensive techniques. No doubt at this point you have noticed the spores that I released, the pollen. You know, the little golden specks of light. Well, those are one of our most powerful defensive measures. It's something that happens only when we are at our most vulnerable, when we fear harm the absolute most, and only become active once we enter that state of complete defense. The spores that we release are somewhat repellent. Any creature that is bothering with us and triggers the spores is hit with a sudden wave of confusion and disorientation. For a short time, usually somewhere around a minute or so, they become incapable of orientating themselves. It's somewhat like suddenly finding yourself completely inebriated. Drunk stupid. They can't balance or think straight. The world spins and they find it hard to keep on their feet. In this short time of not being able to find bearing themselves, we of the Sky Ray are offered an opportunity. Once this happens, we can leave our defensive state and flee. But this is, of course, only a defensive measure. We can't use it to attack, and the spores only have that effect when we are in the complete defensive stance. Otherwise, they're completely harmless. It is our desire to defend ourselves, our fear, that makes the pollen that we produce react to living things in such a way. Normally, you can smell the pollen or feel it, make contact with it, and it will have no negative effects. It will simply smell nice and pleasant. It even actually has a revitalizing effect, filling those who have become tired or weary with energy. It won't help you recover from injury, but in times when you become exhausted, the pollen can rejuvenate those around you. It is often something that we of the Sky Ray use during times of conflict to rejuvenate our allies, fill them with energy once more. However, Rose, the energy does have to come from somewhere. Basically, you're sacrificing a small measure of your own energy in order to regenerate the energy of others. But that's only when it's used in that way. And as I said before, you won't be able to use these abilities until your bloom. You must have pollen, you must have petals, and a blossom in order to use them. So, once you use your bloom, you now at least know what the techniques look like. I think your basic instincts should be enough to allow you to use them, even if you haven't done so before. It was at that point that her mother took a very deep breath. Finally. To be honest, I was walking on eggshells, terrified that you might begin your bloom before I actually showed you these techniques. As I said, based on the size of your bud, it could be any moment, and with your accelerated development, it was worrying me a great deal.